Good morning. Where's my friend Paul here?
Here.
Oh, firstly, I think we have to owe a huge gratitude to someone like Paul. I think he's magical. He's like the glue that brings the community together, right? So can I hear a round of applause for my friend Paul? Paul told me, Ferose, you speak about the future architect. What does the future architect look like? And I'll kind of start by talking about the future engineer and kind of expand that to what a future architect looks like. But I'm very wary of the word future. And I'm using the word future right in the middle of my presentation. And the reason I'm wary of the word future is that it's almost impossible to predict the future. All the experts in the world who predict the future are almost always wrong, but they say it without an iota of doubt. And the reason that all futurists, or most of the futurists, are wrong is because the world has always changed because of black swan events. All of you know what a black swan event is? The black swan was first identified in the year 1697 in Western Australia. Till then, people believed that all swans are white in color. In the last 5 years, we had 2 black swan events. Anybody knows what they are?
COVID.
Fantastic. COVID. What was the second black swan event? November 30, 2022, ChatGPT. That was the second big black swan event. I've done keynotes across the world, and let me tell you, before November 30th, nobody had AI on their presentations. And after November 30th, there is no presentation without AI. Massive black swan event. What is a black swan event? A black swan event is the most unpredictable thing that happens, but when you look back, it looks pretty obvious. AI has been there for the last 70 years. Nobody was talking about AI. Everybody said it's an AI winter. It will take 50 years. Boom, things change. So it's almost dangerous to talk about the future, but I'll try to do that by not looking at the future, but looking at the past, because the past is easy. Everybody knows it. So I'm going to speak about the future engineer or the future architect by looking at the past, because it's much easier. It's driven by data, it's driven by facts, so it's much easier to speak about the future by looking at the past. Everybody told me, Ferose, if you give you a presentation and if you don't have AI, it's a bad idea. So I want to get that thing out of the door. I'm going to start by asking you a couple of questions about AI, and then we'll not speak about AI. Is that a good deal? Because then you shouldn't say, Ferose, you didn't speak about AI. My first question, and this is something that I do quite often, is to ask how many of you in this room is an AI optimist, and how many of you in this room is an AI pessimist? Let me explain what that means. An AI optimist is somebody who believes that the long-term impact of AI on humanity is going to be positive. And an AI pessimist is somebody who says that the long-term impact of AI overall to humanity is going to be negative. So my question is, how many of you in this room is AI optimist? Raise your hands. Oh boy. How many of you are AI pessimists? Raise your hands. Now, I do this question across the world, and I get very different responses. When I'm speaking to a technology crowd, oh boy, everybody is beating their chest. How good is AI? So in a room filled with engineers and architects like you, most of you are saying AI is good for humanity. Not just for technology's sake, but good for humanity. I'm also an author and columnist, and when I go and speak to people who have humanities background, to writers, to poets, they say AI is bad. Everybody raises their hands and they say, I am pessimistic about AI. So what's the right answer? It's somewhere in between. A lot of people say, you have to be an AI realist. So I often try to look at what do philosophers say. and what do they think about AI? I'll not tell you the answer right now because then you won't wait for 30 minutes. You will have to figure this out through my session. So that's the first question. But please keep this question in mind. It's because it's very, very important. The second question I want to ask you is, how many of you are generalists and how many of you are specialists, or how many of you believe that it's important to be a generalist, and how many of you believe it's important to be a specialist? Again, a debate that's been there for hundreds of years, but I want to get a quick hand of people who believe it's important to be a generalist. Raise your hand. How many of you believe it's important to be a specialist? Raise your hands. Much lesser. There's a beautiful book written called Range. The book is called Range, How Generalists Won in a Specialized World. So people who are generalists feel good about it, and that was a big number of people here. Now let me talk about the future engineer or the future architect, but let me put a few interesting data points in front of you. The tool Zillow actually released last week an application which was production grade for 100,000 users, and it was entirely built by AI without a single engineer. No engineer was needed. Production grade software without a single engineer who knew how to code. Google already said this. Sundar Pichai mentioned this, I think, almost 6 months ago, that 25% of the Google code is written by AI, and the prediction is 70 to 80% of all code by end of next year will be written by AI. That's how fast coding is happening by AI. Now, why am I saying this? Because in 2019, I got a call from our current CEO. At that time, he was an executive board member, Christian Klein, saying, Ferose, SAP is an engineering company. We exist because we build breakthrough products, and it typically takes us 10 years to build a breakthrough product. That's the thumb rule. How long did ChatGPT take? Probably 10 years. In the product world, it takes at least 10 years to build a breakthrough product. The last breakthrough product from SAP was in the year 2010 when we released HANA. And of course, then we built on top of HANA, S4 and others. But we haven't built a breakthrough product in more than 10 years. We're 2024. And he said, we have grown through acquisitions. We went around shopping, spent more than $40 billion, shopped a lot, increased our stock price, increased the number of users, but where is the next breakthrough product going to come from? And this was a question Hasso Plattner had asked Christian Klein because he was the head of product at that point in time. Of course, he became CEO in a years from then. He called me and said, Ferose, Hasso wants to know what does it take to build the next breakthrough product? And in our entire history, all breakthrough products were built by engineers. We were founded by 5 engineers, former IBM employees. So they said, if you have to build the next breakthrough product, it has to come from the engineering community. SAP is 100,000 employees, 40,000 engineers, 40,000 salespeople, everybody else in between. He said, can this 40,000 engineers build the product for the future? That was a simple question. Are these engineers of the past? Or can these engineers build the product of the future? They said, Ferose, come back to me with an answer in 2 weeks. I was actually vacationing in Death Valley when I got this call. It was just a 15-minute call, and I often joke that when you get a 15-minute call from a board member, it basically means 2 things. Either you're going to get a new job or going to get fired. That's it. And luckily, it was the former, not the later. He said, come back to me and tell me how can we be sure that we have engineers who can build the next breakthrough product for SAP. This was in 2019. AI was not in the horizon. And I've been thinking about this question very deeply. I have a son who's 16 years old. A lot of my friends have kids of that age group. How many of you have kids around who's going to college? Raise your hands. You know, the big question that most of you are asking are the same things. Are my kids going to learn the skills that are going to be useful to them in the future? Most of these parents come and ask me, Ferose, they're going to do, what should they study? Engineering, medicine, what should they study? What are the jobs of the future? This is the most important question. Are we teaching them skills that are not going to be useful? And I used to tell them the only timeless skill is coding. And I was completely wrong. 2019, I told all my friends, coding. Everybody has to learn coding. Completely automated. Done and dusted. So here is how we decided to figure out the answer. We said we'll look back at the best engineers and architects from the past. We'll understand the skills and values that they built and project it into the future. So we went back and looked at the genesis of engineering and architecture, and looked at the best engineers and architects who have built and engineered some of the greatest pieces of technology or architecture in the world, looked at their characteristics, which were timeless in nature, and projected into the future. The key word is timeless here. A lot of us build skills for that moment. Oh, let's be a Python programmer. Yeah, that's not a timeless skill. Let's be a prompt engineer. That's not a timeless skill. We said we will look at and focus at timeless skills and values and project it into the future, and that's how we are going to know who the best engineers or the architects are. So let's go to the genesis of the word engineer and architecture or architect. The word engineer comes from a Latin word which is called ingenium, which means ingenious, which means clever, which means ability to solve a problem. That's it. So the best engineers are nothing but people who can solve a problem. This is what history tells you, non-debatable. So when I talk about engineers, I say all you need to do is have the ability to solve a problem. That's it, then you're a good engineer. Then we said, who is an architect? All of you or most of you know about enterprise architects, otherwise you won't be here. Let me ask you this question. What is the genesis or the meaning of the word architect? Anybody in this room? The word architect comes from a Latin word called architectum, and that has two words. Archi and tectum. Archi means master, tectum means craftsman. The definition of the word architect is a person who is a master craftsman. That's it. If you understand the meaning of architect, you know what it means. You have to be a master craftsman. Now, it doesn't matter whether you are architecting a building, the Golden Gate, or the internet. You just have to be a master craftsman. Now, there are two fundamental things I'm going to speak about very quickly. What are the 5 skills of the future engineer or an architect? And what are the 5 values of the future engineer or an architect based on history? And I am convinced that these are the skills that you need for the future as well, irrespective of whether AI is there or not. Because I want to focus on the timelessness part of it. The only problem is, Paul gave me 30 minutes. You know, I have a disease which is, it takes me 30 minutes to warm up. I teach at Columbia University. My lectures are typically 2 hours, so I can, kind of warm up into this, but I realize that I'm running out of time. So I'll make it very quick. I'll tell you the 5 skills that we looked at some of the best technologists, architects in history, from Leonardo da Vinci to Tesla, to Eva Lovelace, and to some of the top technologists in the current times, from Vint Cerf, who's the father of the internet, to Ge Wang, who is a top technologists at Stanford. We looked at all of them. We spent a significant time understanding what are the core values and the principles these people demonstrate, and I'm going to share very quickly some of them. I said I have a slide, but if I go through the slide, it takes longer, so I'll kind of quickly share this with you. So take down your notes if you find it interesting. The 5 values or the 5 skills which I believe is timeless for the best or the future engineer or architect are the following. The first, that all the great architects in history fell in love with the problem. They didn't fall in love with the solution. The big mistake most people make is they fall in love with the solution. They go to a customer, they have a problem, they say, here is my solution. You have to fall in love with the problem first. Einstein said it beautifully, if you have 7 days to solve a problem, spend 6 days trying to understand the problem, and the solution will come to you. Fall in love with the problem. The second skill, timeless skill, is be a first principles thinker. Everybody needs to be a first principles thinker. What is a first principles thinker? A first principles thinker is the person who has the ability to break down a problem into the lowest common denominator. And once you break down the problem at the lowest level, you can work upwards. It's a skill that needs to be taught. I've spoken to Windsurf, who's my mentor, who's the founder of the internet, who's the father of the internet, and he says, Ferose, this is one skill that people don't teach, is how to think in first principles. One of the greatest first principles thinker, anybody knows, who's still alive, who's very controversial? Elon Musk is one of the greatest first principles thinker. He says, give me any problem, I can solve it because I can break it down into the first principle level. Whether you have to put a rocket to the Mars, build electric cars, run Twitter very badly, he's a first principles thinker. Give him any problem, he says, I can learn from a book how to get to the first principle level, and I can work upwards. Most people solve the problem at the superficial surface level. If you want to really solve a problem for the long term, be a first principles thinker. All great architects and technologists and engineers have been first principles thinker. Teach first principles thinking. Teach first principles thinking to your children. It doesn't matter what technology they are using, teach them first principles thinking. The second and the third characteristics is you have to be a systems thinker. In a VUCA world that we live in, everybody knows what's a VUCA world? Volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous. We live in a VUCA world. It's volatile, it's uncertain, it's complex, it's ambiguous. The most important ability is to make connections in seemingly disconnected things. The world is incredibly interconnected. You change something here, changes something somewhere else. The ability to make connections in seemingly disconnected things is one of the most important skills that engineers and architects can have. Teach systems thinking. At the SAP Academy for Engineering that I run, we teach systems thinking. Because if you're learning in silos, you're never going to solve the problem. That's what architects need to know. You need to know if you're building or solving a problem in a complex landscape, you change something here, it changes something somewhere else too. So you have to be a systems thinker. The fourth, by far the most important thing that's completely lacking is long-term thinking. People are extremely short-term focused. How can I make my numbers? How does the next quarter look like? And in the process, you screw up humanity. Sam Altman said this. Very controversial. I think he took down this quote, but it's all over the internet because people saw it. He said, AI may as well bring the end of humanity, but in the meantime, we would have created great companies. Google it, you'll find it. AI will as well be responsible for the end of humanity, but in the meantime, we would have created great companies. All the optimists in this room? This is real stuff. I'm not making this up. Please think long term. Very important to understand the consequences of our actions are for our children. You cannot excuse yourself from the consequences at all. You're responsible for it. Think long term. One of the most important things about the greatest engineers of the past was they were thinking long term. They were saying, is this good for humanity? Not whether I made more profits. And the last skill is have a breadth of knowledge, not just depth of understanding. The problem with technologists is that they have no clue about humanities. And the problem with humanities is they have no clue about technologists. And that's why we have completely opposite answers to the same question when I'm asking to engineers, whether I'm asking artists. Completely opposite response. Because people don't have the breadth of understanding. And so the reason I say that all of us need to be generalists is because you need to have a breadth of understanding. People ask, does it mean that you shouldn't be a specialist? You should be a specialist, but the way to do it is what I call as delayed specialization. Start being a generalist, become a specialist over a period of time. Don't do the other way around. Because if you're too narrow in your focus, you would be blinded. You will create great tools. But there's a beautiful saying, a fool with a tool is still a fool. So what is the persona of a future architect? What is the persona of a future engineer? And I'm taking the liberty of the answer that Ge Wang, one of the topmost professors at Stanford, said. He said, the best engineers or the best architects are pie-shaped. They're in the shape of a pie. The two legs are, one leg is deep domain knowledge. So you may be an expert in healthcare, you may be an expert in education, you may be an expert in banking. You need to have deep domain knowledge. The second leg is you need to be very good understanding of a discipline. And what's a discipline? You may be a musician, you may be a technologist, you may be a computer scientist, but you should have deep understanding of a discipline. So you need to have understanding of a domain, you need to have understanding of the discipline. But he says the most important thing is what comes on top of a pie. That's the understanding of the world. That's the context that you are living in. That is the beauty that you want to see. He says the best engineers or the best architects should see the world from the lens of beauty. Because you want the world to be beautiful. You don't want the world to be stressful. He says the best technology should produce calm. What does our technology produce these days? Anxiety. One of the most #1 best-selling books from last year was called The Anxious Generation. And we are responsible for that. He says the best technology should produce calm. The best technologists or the best architects or the best engineers, ladies and gentlemen, he says, is a humanist engineer, is a humanist architect who will architect the world to make it a better place. Not short-term goals, but really long-term outcomes. Paul, am I done with 30 minutes?
You really have 5 minutes, but I'll say 3.
3? Since I have 3 minutes, I'll quickly run through the slides because I want you to deeply understand this. Because this is, as I said, this takes me typically 2 hours to explain. I'm trying to do this very quickly. I'll quickly show you the slides and conclude with a few remarks. As I said, this is the persona of the future engineer or the future architect. The word engineer comes from ingenium. This was first used, the first engineer was Imhotep, who built the Sakka pyramid. He was the first engineer, as per Britannica. The word architecture comes from architectus, a Latin word. People consider the one who built the Taj Mahal as one of the greatest architects, one of the most beautiful pieces of architecture ever built. What are the common traits? So we looked at all of these great engineers. Windsurf is, as I said, the father of the internet. It's fascinating. People who've come to Palo Alto, I will advise you to visit the Hotel Crown Plaza, because there is the architecture of the internet which he and Bob Kahn wrote on a piece of paper. It's still kept there. The entire architecture of the internet in a piece of paper. He says that's what great architects do. They can simplify incredibly complex things into very simple architectural diagram. If you ever come to Palo Alto, please don't miss the chance of where Windsurf and Bob Kahn actually drew the architecture of the internet. It's fascinating, huh? Windsurf built the internet, but everybody else became the billionaire. That's what a great engineer does. He said, I built the internet to make the world a better place, not to become rich. Everybody who built on top of the internet is a billionaire. These are the traits we found of the best architects. They solve a problem, they're good at craftsmen, they have grit, ingenuity, and altruism. The most important thing is altruism here. And I often talk about this in my talks, that the best engineers are givers. How many of you are givers here? Do you know the difference? Very good. How many of you are takers here? So let me very quickly end with this test. I started with a question, I'll end with a test. Adam Grant, one of the most famous psychologists, professor from Wharton, very dear friend of mine, he did this study he looked at 100,000 employees across thousands of large companies. And he said you can divide these employees into 3 categories. Every employee, he said, you can bucket it into 3 categories: a giver, a taker, and a matcher. A giver is a person who gives more than he takes. A taker is a person who takes more than he gives. A matcher is a person who gives as much as he takes. He said every employee in the world can be divided into these 3 categories: a giver, a taker, and a matcher. You all know that, right? You are already thinking, oh, am I a giver? Am I a taker? Oh, this guy who's sitting next to me is a taker. I know that. Everybody is pretty sure about who the taker is. But here was the interesting thing of the study. He said, who is going to be the most successful person in an organization? Is it a giver, is it a taker, or a matcher? Anybody who thinks it's going to be a matcher, raise your hands. Okay, that's like 40%. How many of you think it's the taker who's going to be successful? Raise your hands. Very good. How many of you think it's going to be the giver who is going to be successful? Very few. Okay, maybe 40, 40, 20. Now here is the answer. Adam Grant said the bottom 20% in every organization is a giver. Why is that? Because the giver is always ending up doing somebody else's job and never finishes his job. And he doesn't speak up. He's like, okay, sorry, I forgot to finish mine, I was helping somebody else. And the manager has no clue who did the real work. So the bottom 20% in every organization is a giver. But he also found something incredible. He said the top 20% are also givers. Most of the time. But what happens is that he found very interesting that also in the short term, the takers can move it to the top. In the short term, very quickly, a person who's a taker can move to the top. Over a long period of time, people figure out who the taker is. So the takers jump They realize, oh, their game is up in this company, let me move to somewhere else. Before people recognize, they move on. The takers are very successful in the short run. So you may ask, what is the role of a matcher? A matcher is very important because it's the matcher who always promotes the giver to the top. When the givers and the takers are at the same level, it's the matcher who says it's the giver who needs to move to the top. History has shown that the best people in the world, the true altruists, the best engineers built software, built products, built technology to make the world a better place because they were fundamentally givers. They were not about themselves. So if there's one final thing, I say that being a giver is a good strategy. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You know the drill.
Talking about givers and takers, it's time to take
Take a photo.